The first secret is this. This is not a real person. This is a reference I used for painting this. Studying the planes of the face is one of the best ways to practice your watercolor skills. Since we're using watercolors instead of shading, practice using one cool color, that is, a color with blue in it to simplify things, and one warm color, leaving the lightest planes blank. Use the cool color for the darkest planes and the warm color for the second lightest planes. Again, you're leaving the lightest planes blank. And this brings me to my second point. Use a limited palette. It can be overwhelming to have a lot of colors to work with. Simplify things for yourself by choosing no more than 6 colors to work with. You can really get all the colors you need from mixing red, yellow, and blue, but adding in some additional pre-made earth tones such as burnt sienna or sepia can also be really useful in the context of your painting. When looking at faces or looking at anything really, there are 2 things that we're looking at. Local value, which is the intrinsic color of the subject, and then reflected light, so what colors surrounding what you're painting are reflecting off of it. So you want to have some colors that are showing the reflected light and color, and some colors just for things like the hair, the lips, or the irises that show a bit of the local value, that is, the color intrinsic to the subject. Which brings up another point. With watercolor portraits, you are going to want to leave much larger highlights, that is, areas you don't paint, than you would otherwise. This is because you may need to bring all the values up to a lighter level in order to make your darkest watercolors really read as dark. Watercolors are inherently light unless you really saturate your brush, and if you're saturating your brush to get the darkest values, you may find that gouache is a better alternative. You want to have a reason why you use a particular medium for a particular subject, and one reason you might use watercolors for a subject is that they mirror, to a certain extent, the reflectivity of skin, which is similar to water in a way. And that brings up another point. To get that super luminous effect that some watercolor artists achieve, emphasize your core shadows. Core shadows basically are the corners of objects. If you can emphasize the reflected light, so that's essentially the area of shade that's reflecting light and color back from the lighter areas, you'll get something that looks luminous. So the darkest areas are not the parts furthest away from us, as we sometimes think. The darkest areas are where you have an edge on the face or any object you're looking at. Emphasizing that will create a sense of luminosity. Here's something else. The nose is super important. The nose occupies 2 different planes. The muzzle of the mouth, and it has its own tilt from person to person with the cartilage. Therefore, this tiny little highlight at the base of the nose tells us a huge amount of what the face you're painting is shaped like. Pay close attention to the highlight on the nose when you're working from a reference to get a sense of the person you're painting. And for this next one, a common mistake is to think that the lips are a drastically different color than the rest of the face, or drastically darker. Unless your model is wearing lipstick, lips are actually going to have just the lightest slash of local color, and instead incorporate many of the same skin tones you're using in the face. Instead of thinking about lips in terms of color, think about them in terms of volume and light. The upper lip will usually be darker than the lower lip, with the lower lip reflecting a lot of light. Instead of coloring in both lips at once, the form of the lower lip can be created not by painting the lip itself, but by shaping the dimple underneath the lower lip. At the very end of the painting, you can glaze a bit of local value, so a different red family, over the lips you've created using the skin tones you're using for the rest of the face. And on that note of color, eye whites. We tend to think of the whites of the eyes as just that, white, and leave them blank while painting. However, this is just perception. The whites of your eyes will be reflecting all the color surrounding them, and usually this makes them a sort of muddy green. You can get a fairly accurate eye white color simply by including the whites of the eyes in some of the washes or glazes you're using on the rest of the face. You may also want to be judicious about your brush strokes, and one way to do this is to have a variety of brushes and only use the larger ones for larger areas. This can be really helpful if you're using student-grade watercolor paper that can't hold as many layers of saturation as a higher-grade paper can. So this can be a little bit of a challenge. Just experiment with it, don't worry too much about it, but ultimately, you want to be using fairly limited brush strokes. Another tip is to keep a black pen handy. You can control the chaos of your watercolors if you need to move back in and tighten up areas like the eyes, the nostrils, or the sides of the lips.
Finally, and this is a cheat, but one quick way to get your skin looking like skin again if your colors are looking muddy is to create a darker background. Indigo works well for this. I'm actually using Sennelier ink here, not watercolor, because it'll give me a denser color. Because our perception of skin depends on what's surrounding it, you can simply lighten values that have gotten too dark by darkening the background. It's also a good way to retrim the face if your colors have bled out. So there's my 10 tips for watercolor portraiture. If you have any questions or areas you'd like to see covered, or if you'd like to share a few tips of your own, just leave a note in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for watching.